Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. Cybersecurity solutions provider Trellix recently unveiled their 2023 Voice of the CISO report. Among other topics, it explored the top 5 challenges cited by Chief Information Security Officers who responded to the Trellix survey. In order, these main challenges included too many sources of information, a growing attack surface created by remote workers, increasingly complex supply chain and other social and business factors, changing regulatory mandates, difficulties retaining and recruiting staff with the necessary security skills, and a lack of buy-in from other parts of the company. Although these responses were not exclusively drawn from the industrial sector, they all apply. These results not only help shine a light on the universal complications of defending IT and OT environments, but the importance of having these conversations in the light of day. Information on vulnerabilities, attacks, and losses need to be shared, right along with the wins experienced through penetration tests, patching, and working with law enforcement in order to better understand the appropriate resources to apply to each unique security environment. We have to embrace greater supply chain visibility amongst partners and educate workers throughout the organization in reinforcing and strengthening the human element of cyber defense. Proactive measures and universal support needs to be a priority in order to accurately respond to the evolving regulatory and business continuity efforts that surround cybersecurity. And finally, the vital roles of security experts must be touted and reinforced throughout educational institutions and the manufacturing enterprise in the same vein as law enforcement and national defense. I have a feeling that our guest for today's episode would agree on all these fronts. But before we talk to him, we're excited to announce that Security Breach is being sponsored by Pentera. For more information on how automated security validation can help you safely test all your IT security controls with a click of a button in a non-stop industrial operational environment, you can visit pentera.io. It's now my pleasure to introduce Karan Santi, Trellix's Chief Technology Officer. Trellix is a leading provider of extended detection and response strategies. Karan, thanks so much for joining us today. I really appreciated the Mind of the CISO report that you guys put out. There's a number of things that I'm hoping we can talk about. But before we do that, I was wondering if there's any particular points from the survey there, the report, that you found more interesting or more top of mind that you maybe want to discuss to start.
Yeah, things have gotten a lot more complicated and a lot worse, haven't they? I read the report, and it's funny, you never see the percentages decrease on any of them, which is like, hey, there's more events and more incidents, there's more security breaches, there's more complexity in the security environment. These reports never go out and say, hey, things are going to look simpler down the road. So I think that's one of the big takeaways, is that things are getting more and more complicated. And look, that's just the reality. When we have the same conversation 5 years from now, we're going to be talking about how AI has made the landscape a lot more complicated and a lot more or less predictable than it was probably 5 years ago, when we're talking about things from 5 years ago back to today. So that was one. Two, I'm surprised that even to this day, ransomware has a sticky presence. I thought they would start to taper away, to be honest. I thought more CISOs and more organizations are going to be pay more attention to some of the hygiene related activities. Like, hey, let's stay on top of our patch management. Let's stay on top of phishing attacks. Let's try to get better at getting rid of legacy software and legacy capabilities that are going to become sort of a breeding ground for ransomware attacks. So I'm surprised that those numbers are continuing to increase, and they're still quite sticky in big organizations. And some of the other kind of anecdotal things that came out is obviously the things that every person who probably came before me on this podcast said, finding the right talent, not enough people, things are getting harder in terms of retaining people in the SOC. Things are getting more challenging and making sure that the right skills are available in the marketplace so we have enough people to come in and resolve these events. So those anecdotal things were pretty prevalent in the report too. One thing I did want to talk about, and I think it's going to be a good conversation for the two of us, is that 20 years ago, when security was really being looked at, it was about pushing to make security sort of the core function of a company. And the response from big organizations and from government regulators was, hey, let's create compliance in the marketplace. What's unfortunate is 20 years later, in a report, we're seeing CISO saying that we're still compliance focused, that really dealing with the actual security breaches and making my security operations modern and sophisticated, and focusing on some of the newer, sexier, interesting tools is sort of falling by the wayside because they're so focused on compliance. And that's something that I thought was really unfortunate in this role in this company, that it's become, there were multiple sections where compliance related activities were becoming a burden because it was either unclear what compliance they had to meet, or there was so much emphasis and focus on compliance that it was taking up a lot of their time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we start talking about compliance, and especially a lot of those things probably prior to maybe the last 3 or 4 years, it was very IT focused. So we're talking a lot about data and financial and intellectual property. And I think going back to your point about the complexity, especially of ransomware attackers, how they've upped their game. And it's really now when we look at the vulnerabilities, especially in the industrial sector, it's logins. So it's a lot of dealing with the human factors, so to speak, which is tough to legislate and regulate people into doing the right things when it comes to protecting all those access points. Or again, going back to manufacturing, there's so much investment going on right now that it's less about IT and more about operational technology. And when organizations try to sort of cut and paste a lot of that IT stuff into the plant floor security part of it, it just
Yeah,
doesn't mesh. It just doesn't
true.
work. And
No, you're right. You're right. I mean, that's a fair point, right? So some of the techniques that are being applied by CISOs or even security experts, right? It's not really just the CISO's responsibility when they're trying to bring it to OT systems. They are bringing some of the natural tendencies to bring those best practices over. It's not one to one. You're right. It's not one to one. But there's some parallels that they're starting from, which is, hey, do we have a good patch management process for updating these OT systems? And guess what? The answer is no. I mean, when's the last time that you really paid attention to your Nest thermostat updates, right? If it's not happening automatically by the vendor, there's nobody who's really going in and updating it because either they didn't have a feature in there that they really cared about, or they really completely forgot that they had something that they had to update. So it's good that they're bringing that up. You're starting to see a greater emphasis in looking and identifying, hey, what are all the different OT systems, and what is going to be our approach to identifying them, isolating them. I hope CISOs and security experts are realizing that you don't want it to be yet another IP address in your massive swarm of IT systems you're managing. You want to segregate it and separate it so that you have a completely different set of practices that you can apply to your point, right? To your point, which is you can't just cookie cutter bring those same security practices to OT. And then you have to start thinking about, specialized tools. We're going to be, hopefully announcing some partnerships later this year, at least in the public sector market, with companies that provide a lot more hydrated and deep validity data, or I'm sorry, a deep, what's the right word I'm looking for here? Deep forensics data, deep enriched data. That's the word that was escaping me. Deep enriched data on OT systems, right? These are companies that know how these microcontrollers are designed, what these microcontrollers are spitting out, who the company was that wrote the software, which is not always the same as the company that produced the end product. Like you and I might go to a hospital, right? The little blood pressure medicine that might be connected to some nurse's workstation. I bet you all the components inside of it were not built by the company's logo that you might see on the outside. They're going to be a whole bunch of third-party companies. There might be Motorola that might have built the chip, and there might be a third-party company that wrote the software. And then the component that's actually speaking to the network or providing that data might be a third company. So you have a whole bunch of hodgepodge of different companies' data that's in there. And you're going to need companies that specialize in understanding that and contextualizing it, so that when tools like the ones that our company provides at the XDR level, right? And we'll talk more about that down the road. But when you're bringing in that specialized OT data to a platform where your security operations teams are sitting, they can say, oh, okay, I have all this enriched insight into what's going on with a heart monitor, or what's going on with a pipeline. I'm not a big oil and gas guy, but I would imagine there might be something that's looking at the pressure of the pipelines, or might be measuring the flow of the oil going through the pipeline, right? What's that telemetry mean? If it's dropped quite a lot, is it maybe a physical attack that somebody did, or maybe it's an outage that I need to pay attention to? And on a heart monitor, if there's a big principal from the government that's residing in that hospital, and there is a potential breach, you want to pay attention to it, right? Maybe that heart monitor is critical to, I'm going to make up some exaggerated, entities, but maybe a president or a vice president, right? They could be a potential attack vector for someone who cares enough to monitor and see what's going on. Maybe they want to get early insights into what's going on in their health. or something like during COVID, they might want to collect this telemetry and understand, where all these patients and what kind of diseases and viruses are they being hit with. So you want to protect all this. The hospital doesn't want this data to go out. The U.S. government doesn't want this data to go out. And if you're a company who's providing services or security monitoring, you certainly don't want this data to be publicly available.
Yeah, I'm going to circle back to the report. You brought up a couple of interesting points there. I hope we can dive into a little bit more. The first was what you talked about, the patches. It's interesting because looking at the industrial sector, we have two basic groups. We've got the folks that are patching everything, and in doing so, they're being very diligent there. But it's sort of like, well, okay, the patch is taking care of it, so we're good, as opposed to looking more closely at the situation.
Those guys that are patching, by the way, they deserve a reward. They should get a poster. I mean, it's happening in very isolated cases. So if you find them, they should be heroes. They should be getting a star on the Hollywood, walk there.
So we've got that group. Then we've also got the group that's basically ignoring them, saying, hey, I'm working with suppliers. I've got stuff in the cloud. I don't want to deal with this stuff. That's what I have vendors and suppliers for. So in your experience in working with these two disparate type of groups, how do we get, what have you found, I guess, in working with customers, how do you get them to pay closer attention to what they're doing in understanding the patches are important, but you also need to also go the next step and understand what was going on that created the need for that patch potentially, or at least just, and I think it all relates back to really visibility within the system that we struggle with so much, and you kind of referenced with the medical example.
Yeah, so look, I mean, there's going to be different maturities of different companies and organizations, right? But we have to establish standards. You have to be able to ride a bicycle, maybe be able to ride a golf cart, and maybe be able to ride a car before you'll be ready to drive a truck, right? There's stages in which you want to get to before you'll be allowed to be on the road. We need to kind of get to the same point with OT systems. So they need to get visibility on what's out there first. So let's hope that's a baseline, which is, hey, what are the OT systems that you have? Did you even know that you had these? Some people are actually shocked and surprised they have so many internet connected or IP address spewing devices, right? Forget about managed devices. There's something with an IP address sitting out there on the network they didn't even know. If you have visibility, then you can start having conversations about what you want to do with it. Do you want to patch it? Or it's so critical that if you push a patch to it and it fails, there's no failover to that controller. Literally, this is the only thing that's keeping the grid running, maybe, or this is the only thing that's monitoring the electricity in the building. And if we push a patch to it and it goes out, it creates a cascading set of, events that we can't come back from, or we won't be able to quickly come back from. So there's going to be different conversations that security leaders are going to have about it. But vast majority of them require a lot of time and effort. I mean, you read the CISO report. It's not like they have less events to deal with and less problems to deal with. Now they have one more thing, which is its own sort of gamut of problems and issues, which is OT systems. So I don't sympathize with a lot of these CISOs that have so much on their plate already, and OT systems sort of adds to that level of complexity. But there is a methodical way and a systematic way to go out there and actually start addressing them.
No, it makes sense. It's all part of having that plan in place, which a lot of manufacturers are still in the works, still have that in the works, still struggling to get that really together as a cohesive document. But I think there have been a lot of positive strides being made. Another thing you mentioned, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying, yeah, you're right. I think it's going to take some time. We're going to get to a point where there's going to be enough consistency and practices around OT that there's going to be standards and approaches that people are going to start to adopt. We have that today with endpoint security. You're going to start seeing that in OT systems as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You brought up another interesting point, something that we kind of refer to as secure by design, especially in the industrial sector when, yes, okay, a pump is still a piece of mechanical equipment, but it's attached to a lot of instrumentation and a lot of sensors to get very sensitive readings. And when we're bringing in a lot of this more advanced technology or Industry 4.0 technology that we might call it, and we're connecting it to sort of legacy systems, that creates an issue. Now, from the manufacturer, they're saying, I want to get up and running. Let's get it in. Let's take advantage of all these new efficiencies. We need somebody from security to step in and say, hey, wait a minute. Let's make sure all the secure by design elements of these new components are configured, are set up correctly, and that they're working the way we need them to protect the entire network. In working with customers, what are some of the things that you're hearing in terms of, are they embracing this secure by design element? Are they relying on it too much potentially?
Yeah, so most companies that we're talking to, and particularly in the government sector, they're just really getting started in their whole mindset around managing OT systems. They weren't first to the cloud, but by the time they adopted cloud, they had standards and processes around it that made it easier for the government to really start adopting the technology. And I won't bore you with some of the regulation, but there's things like FedRAMP out there. There's a whole lot of different contracts that the government's put out there. So you're going to see, at least in the public sector and the space that I operate in, you're going to start to see some regulatory frameworks and NIST guidelines to help people figure out, okay, what are some standardized practices around managing this? But I think the right approach, and this is, I'm going to sort of double down on this conversation about just doing some of the basic things right up front. If you're good, if the security person is coming in and having a conversation with, let me recap what you had put out there, which is you've got legacy OT systems that have legacy code, legacy infrastructure, and a legacy framework, but then you have all this new technology, Industry 4.0, to the quoted words that you provided, right? They want to bring in, but they want to integrate the two, and there's a potential challenge there in data compliance. There might be more fidelity of data that might be coming out from this new 4.0 tech, but you've got this legacy stuff that can't, give out all the same level of fidelity data just because it's super simplified. It was built 40 years ago when there was no mindset about, using anything on the internet maybe. The right way is going to be the one that makes sense for the context of the customer, right? And let me put that in simpler words. For something that's super critical, like the electrical grid, the water systems, the oil pipelines, you have to be very careful. The right approach might be, and I'm not an oil guy, but I think this might be something that somebody would be able to relate to, is you got a legacy pipeline, you've got legacy stuff there. Maybe we leave that alone. But any new pipeline that we built and new technology that we adopt there, we have a whole different framework. So you have basically a old security operations center dashboard or process that just deals with your legacy system. And then you have a new one that's designed for the newer system. And the best analogy I have for you, it's like you're going to have to fly that 747 plane and the new 777 plane in parallel. And slowly you're going to start offloading those passengers midair, and you got to do it carefully, into the new 777, right? So nobody falls off in the air and there's no wind kicking them off, right? I mean, maybe not the best analogy, but I think you get the picture.
Yeah.
That's going to have to be the approach. Both planes will have to fly, and then eventually you're going to sunset that old plane because you got all the customers onto the new platform. You have all your data and security practices onto the new platform. But you want to be careful about commingling both of them and managing both of these systems the exact same way. Because down the road, when you're ready to let go of this legacy system and start this new process, the new systems that you brought in are now stuck with a process that don't make sense, right? This is exactly the conversations I have with the government, which is you're applying security standards to newer SaaS-based products using a mindset of everything being, infrastructure, like data center and IaaS platform. When you're looking at SaaS capabilities, you got to have a completely different mindset, right? The technology and the capabilities way more advanced. You don't need a lot of the paperwork that you ask for. You don't need a lot of the monitoring and regulation that you ask for. So you got to apply newer practices. So my hope is when it comes to OT systems that they segregate the two. You have a new approach and a new process in place for newer tech. You keep your legacy stuff segregated and separate. Eventually you just migrate over either your grid or your physical infrastructure over to this newer tech.
Well, I think the key there, and I agree with the approach, it's also being mindful of the fact that you still have this legacy system and it doesn't work the same way that the new stuff does, and just appreciating that. As long as you're cognizant of those two differences, you can overcome a lot of those potential issues that could arise if you don't. So
yeah, and look, for the listeners out there and the people who might be paying attention to this, right, it's going to vary widely based on your context, because OT systems is like talking about, hey, you have an internet connected laptop. Okay, what's the security risk of an internet connected laptop? Well, it depends. If you're, if you're a home user, your context is to make sure your credit cards don't get stolen, but you may not care too much. I mean, there's always risk that you may not care too much that your photos got spewed out from your computer. But if you're a corporation, you care a ton about any data leaving your machine. So you're going to have DLP, you're going to monitor every single file coming in and out of there, because that's your IP and your asset. The same analogy is going to follow through in the OT side, which is what is the thing you care about most? What's most critical to you? Uptime. All right, got it. So let's focus on making sure uptime of your electrical grid is the attack surface that we need to monitor. Forget about everything else, right? If that's the context that matters the most, which is availability, let's focus on that and let's purely make that, the goal of the legacy system. Whereas for newer tech, it's like, hey, we want to also make sure it's efficient. All right, well, there's going to be efficiency metrics that come out of it. We also want to know what the load is at any given time so that maybe we can offload it to another grid. Okay, now you've got other telemetry data that you want to pull out of these OT systems and be able to share it with both security and operations teams. So context matters greatly in how you're going to apply your security standards.
No, it makes a ton of sense. Circling back to the report a little bit, one of the things that really caught my attention was what was identified as the leading concern from a lot of CISOs, from the majority of CISOs. And they talked about having on average 25 unique security tools in place and just basically being inundated with all of this data and not sure knowing what to use, what to prioritize. Well, that blew me away in terms of having all that. First of all, if you've got the resources that you can invest in 25 different tools, I think that's pretty cool. But obviously you want to have a little more focus. What advice could you give maybe to some of those security professionals out there who are dealing with just this inundation of resources or potential resources to use to help meet their needs?
I can so relate to this. So when I ran security engineering, every time we either measured a risk or identified a major vulnerability and we went and looked to see if we had a tool that covered it, there were specialized capabilities or specialized gaps that we had to fill, we'd have to buy a new tool. Now that tool is going to generate logs. Those logs are going to generate a whole bunch of events, and now you have to watch it. So what happened is over time, I would imagine this has been true for a lot of CISOs, is they've had to buy tools to cover gaps, security gaps and measure, risks in their enterprise. But over time, they didn't have really a plan for how they're going to actually resolve events and incidents that come out. Let me use an analogy before I get too deep into this world. Do you have you don't have to name the vendor, but you probably have a bunch of security cameras around your house, either a Ring camera or a Google one, right?
Sure.
Do you realistically have time to go through every single camera and try to identify somebody who might be walking around your house or trying to steal your package? No, right?
No.
This is the exact same thing. They don't have time to look for every single potential threat vector that they're going to be, faced against. They want these 25 tools to either go away or for a tool to sit on top of it and provide context. And really, that's our sweet spot, right? The XDR platform that we build, and certainly other companies in this space too, but really the one that we specialize in is really giving you context and using machine learning technology to bring security relevant data forward. So when you have 25 tools in your environment and you have hundreds and thousands of events that you're dealing with, you're never going to keep up with, just like you don't have enough time to look at the camera. But I bet you, when somebody rings the doorbell or somebody leaves a package in the front of your door, Ring or Google have come up with tech that tells you, hey, a package has been left. And you have decided that that's enough relevant context on that event that you want to be notified, because you might be getting a brand new MacBook Air, like the one I'm using right now, right? Literally, it just came on the front door 15 minutes ago. So I want to know because, right, there's a big asset sitting at my front door that I want to grab before somebody else does, a porch pirate maybe. Same thing for security managers, right? And SOC managers. They want contextualized information. They don't care when maybe the IT enterprise has pushed a patch that made a server go down or made a critical change to Windows. It's like, any traditional SIM tool is going to say, hey, wait, there's somebody who pushed a change to the Windows kernel. Well, yeah, it was a patch update. I don't need to see that. It was relevant. It was okay. Why am I being alerted on this? I already have enough things to look at, right? So traditional SIM or traditional, of these 25 tools, they're going to spew out all these events. Somebody's walking a dog in the front of your lawn. You don't care about that, right? Now, Absolutely. But if that update came from an external IP address during a time window that I know we don't push patches on, and it happened from a user identity that, was, maybe somebody stole a credential, or somebody's two-factor authentication capability was compromised and they made it all the way in. But there were certain behaviors of that user that triggered an alert from our tool that said, hey, look, from the context of everything I'm seeing, this looks anomalous. Now you have something that you can go target and kind of go chase down, because there's just going to be too many events otherwise for you to pay attention to. That package being left at your front door is enough for you to look at your phone and decide, okay, yeah, I want to go take a look at it. And I want to go look at the front door, or I want to see the camera feed a little bit longer, and then make a decision if I want to walk all the way to the front door. So that's really where the industry is headed. I sympathize with the CISOs that are facing 25 tools and millions of events that they have to pursue.
No, I think the prioritizing of data throughout the industrial sector is a huge concern, especially in the security element. It all kind of bleeds back to visibility in terms of understanding what is the data you want to see. And I think what's really changing in the big transition is those temperature spikes before, when it didn't go too far where it was affecting productivity. Well, now we have to look at those. That could be an embedded hacker just sort of probing and seeing how you react. So it is being more scrutinizing a lot of that data more closely. But like you alluded to, there's so much data to look at potentially. It's not getting bogged down to the point where it can become white noise almost in terms of what you're looking at and scanning for.
Exactly. You're going to want to rip out those cameras, man. If it's, every time it buzzes off and gives you an alert that
Yeah.
somebody's walking a dog in front of your lawn, right? You're going to go
Yeah.
crazy. So the same things happen to CISOs. They want these to go away. And one quick comment I'll make on top of that, there is also a need, though. 25 tools is a lot. It depends on the context, of course, of who you are and what you're doing. But if the CISO or the SOC manager feels just their gut instinct says, God, we have way too many tools, there's a very systematic way to clean that up. So we actually do this a lot for our customers for free. We'll go in and do a survey of your environment. We'll help you see the gaps in either the tools that you have or overlaps in the tools that you've already purchased or purely duplicative tools that you have. And sometimes you need an outsider to come in just because you've been putting out fires all day. You're just, at it like a machine, and you just need an outside person to come in and look at it, give you some context and data to make a decision on. So we do this often, and the approach that maybe some of your listeners can steal that might be useful is when you have the sense that you want to reduce the number of tools, do an audit. Just do it the old-fashioned way. You don't need anything sexy or fancy, right? Just write it down on a notepad if you have to, or a spreadsheet. And then decide, okay, of these, and you can maybe use, I can't remember the name of it, but there was this Netflix show, which is if you don't feel the energy when you touch a piece of clothing or you don't feel like you want to keep it, there's a method for it. Maybe it'll come back to me later on. But when you feel like, hey, wait a minute, I've had this tool in here, but it's not like the number one priority for me. Great. Start writing them off, right? As you feel an emotional connection because you understand the data that comes out of this tool and what problems it solves for you, start ranking it higher. So list all your tools, start prioritizing them, evaluate their effectiveness. Just because you had it doesn't mean it was giving you any value. Go talk to your team and say, over the past 6 months, this tool has been generating 10,000 events. Have we done anything with this data? Yeah. If the issue was that you had the data, but you didn't know what to do with it, certainly companies like ours can help you with that, right? We can take that context and give you better threat hunting capabilities. But if you didn't use it even for threat hunting and we came in and said, we don't really need this, it doesn't really do anything that we couldn't get from other tools that you already have, ditch it. Yeah. And then go into like the cycle of constant evaluation. Like you've already down selected to 5 or 10 tools and said, hey, these are the core tools that I need. Look for other vendors. See, hey, have they been the best that I picked 3-4 years ago? Maybe they're not the best anymore and I need to look at a new vendor. You can start to get that 25, the more than 25 tools number down to something more manageable using these steps.
Now, I like how you kind of talked about it doesn't have to be complex. I mean, there's a lot of things in cybersecurity that are difficult and challenging and complex. You can take a very simple, systematic approach, at least initially, to start weeding things out and making your life a little bit easier. I like that. Transitioning, if we can, from porch pirates to ransomware groups and malware hackers a little bit. Another thing that was brought up as a huge concern for CISOs is the fact that it's just an expanding attack surface right now. Now, I think a lot of that is, you mentioned ransomware before. We did see sort of maybe a balancing a little bit in 2022, but then in 23, the attacks just surged again. I think a lot of that is because they changed their methods, their avenues of approach a little bit, and their attack strategies, focusing, it seems like, a lot more on people and the human factor. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, when we talk about this broadening attack surface, is it more infrastructure, or is it more people, or a combination of both?
So the attack surface. Look, let me maybe give you a simple pitch. Email, right? You and I use it every day. What do we fall more prey to? Somebody knocking on our door, somebody putting something in the mail, or somebody sending us a very convincing email that there was some, cryptocurrency that needed to be validated, or a Coinbase account or Binance account, or whatever your flavor of the day is of things that you care about. That link is looking more and more believable day by day. In fact, even I have to pause for a second and say, is this legit? Because it looks pretty legit. I have to actually dig in, open the
Yeah.
window and look at the address and be like, wow, this was really, really convincing. It was what's crazy is 20 years ago, it used to just be, spray and pray. They would just send out these mass links and be like, all right, somebody's going to click on it and fall victim to it. Now they understand the user because there's enough data about me out there in the public internet that they can, thanks to ChatGPT and Bard from Google, it's like a piece of cake. You put this
Yeah.
context on, hey, write a very convincing email to a CTO for a cybersecurity company and get them to respond to me. And it's going to give you some ideas that you'll be able to steal and not even know anything about Trellix. You could be somebody sitting in Timbuktu, not knowing anything about security, not knowing anything about me, but all of a sudden now a tool made it easy for you to write a very tailored message with context, convince me to click on a link. It is still to this day the number one attack vector. So you're right. Humans are still the ones that are enabling attacks for attackers. But I sympathize with them. Like, it's not their fault.
Yeah.
These things are getting way and way more convincing. And, it's the innocent person who's like, well, of course I want to validate my O365 account because I won't be able to log into Teams and get into my meeting tomorrow morning. So let me log in and put in my credentials. And now, boom, those credentials have been stolen. And even two-factor authentication credentials are very easy to steal now because people aren't doing a good job of actually using context on that, right? You want to understand where the user's logging in from, where they're logging in, where they're logging in from, when they're logging in, giving more context on the user. So yeah, phishing attacks, number one attack to this day. I think the second one, physical attacks are really, it depends on where you are in the industry, where you would really pay attention to it. If you're in the government, yeah, it's the sophisticated nation and state attacks want to go after physical infrastructure. If you look at the average hacker, they have no real incentive to go do a distributed denial of service on the electrical grid. Like, what are they going to get out of it? They're not going to get any money out of it, right?
Right.
But if you're a nation state, that's enough to maybe slow things down or do it in an opportunistic way because a big congressman might be flying out of that city, and if you take out the power, maybe he'll create enough havoc or raise enough delays in his process that he might not make it to a big meeting, right? Depending on what the nation state's objectives are. And I gave a very muted one. There's a lot more sophisticated ones. Unfortunately, I can't share those. But depending on the context of what the nation state wants, they can go after these physical infrastructures and really discreetly or very systematically make sure that the outcome that they're looking for would happen. So physical attacks, I think, still happen in nation-state use cases. The regular phishing attacks are happening globally, no matter where you are, from a commercial perspective, because the hackers want to get paid. They want you to click on the link so they can steal your credentials, go into your network and either steal some data or go into your network and go put some ransomware so they can get paid. It's simple. They just want to get paid one way or another.
And that does help offer some depth in terms of how that attack surface is growing. I mean, there's a lot of different routes that the hacker can take, especially, again, for industrial sector. There's a lot of nation states who would love to shut down Ford, okay, or attack because there is obviously an economic benefit for them potentially if they're going to attack industry. And now what we're learning too with a lot of these attacks that go after just a link in the supply chain, if you will, understanding, hey, if we shut down, like not too long ago, there's a Dole Foods plant that suffered a significant malware attack. Well, shutting them down doesn't just shut down that facility. It impacts transportation and logistics. It impacts retailers. It impacts the end user, as well as the growers and everybody else before it gets to the facility. So that greater understanding makes industrial cybersecurity so much more important, not just within our marketplace, not just within those enterprises, but really at large throughout our country, throughout our society and our culture. So it's why it's important to have these conversations, not to get too deep here, but...
Yeah, no, I mean, you're spot on, right? You can imagine, like if you put on a sort of an evil hat on, right, and think about the worst case scenario, it's not unrealistic to think that industrial security would maybe, turn on each other. Let's say there's some competitive reason why either one hospital wants to make sure the other hospital doesn't succeed, or one hotel doesn't want the other hotel to succeed, or one manufacturer of some critical parts doesn't want the other one to succeed. And they may have a financial incentive to shut you down, either before they're doing a fundraise or before they're doing an IPO, or just because they don't like the company and the CEO, right? I mean, it's not hard to imagine that there would be financial incentives for within the industry for each other to be attacking each other, right? Sometimes people are cooperative, but look, we've seen IP theft. back and forth, because that's the thing that kept tech companies, competitive with each other. Industrial, maybe IP is a part of it, but not being able to service a bunch of clients and having a bunch of outages may make your power grid look better, right? If it's privatized. Or your hospital system, if it's, going to be in a very competitive area, maybe the other hospitals want to make sure that, and I'm not saying this is happening, but it's not unplausible. It's not unrealistic to think that this could happen at some point in time. So you want to protect against your competition, because you just never know what their incentives are. Or a foreign business that wants to come and invest in the space, and they want to take you out so they can have a more friendly investment landscape. So there are all sorts of evil scenarios why you would want to kind of protect yourself and make sure you're up to date and patched and all secure.
Absolutely. Another thing, I'm sure you've been talking a lot about this. We've been talking a lot more on the program. It's artificial intelligence and AI and the potential impacts it can have on cybersecurity. You mentioned it's definitely going to make things, or continue to make things, more complex, puts another tool in the toolbox of the hackers. I would argue it also gives the white hats a little bit of a tool as well to use in defense of their enterprise or their business. Where do you stand? What do you think AI's impact is going to be? Is it even-handed, or does it kind of skew one way or the other?
So, it's funny, even if AI wasn't in the picture, and I talk a lot about it, and I'm happy to kind of dive into it, but I want to give some context too. And the home analogy seems to be working so far. I'm just going to keep using it, right? Isn't it true, would you not agree, Jeff, that there's more ways somebody could come into your house than there is a physical or realistic ability for you to protect against it, right? You've got your front door, you've got a deadbolt on it, but there's a window, you've got just a tiny little notch that's preventing the window. They could break it with a glass, like with a rock, right?
Yeah.
And they're in your house. You could put a camera there, but you can't monitor every single angle. You can't look at your roof. What if somebody came from a dead spot on your camera and come on your roof and found a way to get into your attic, so there's always going to be more ways to attack a system or to get into a system than there will be ways for you to protect it. And what happens is, when tools like AI-generated malware or AI-generated phishing attacks come out, there's going to be more ways for attackers to get in. There's going to be more ways for you to fall vulnerable to a link. Guarantee you've at least been tempted to click on some of those links that were in your mailbox at least once in your career, right?
Sure.
I certainly have. I'm not saying I'm the sharpest knife in the door. I've certainly fallen victim to it many years ago too. So they're very convincing. So what's going to happen is, a bunch of college kids who know nothing about it, a history major could go in, and if they needed a financial incentive to go convince somebody to click on a Coinbase email to go steal, grandma's or some teenager's cryptocurrency in a wallet, he doesn't need to know anything about attacking. They don't need to know anything about malware. They just need to go into the tool and say, hey, I found some code already. I learned something about polymorphic malware. I don't know what it is, but it just means that it morphs and it can't get detected.
Right.
I'm going to copy this code. I'm going to put it in this generative AI tool, and I'm going to have the generative AI tool spit out some malware that's completely unique that the world has never seen. And my hope is that the enterprise that I hit it on, or the user I hit it on, doesn't have fancy tools like EDRs that will look for these indicators of compromise or look for these behaviors, and they're going to fall victim to it. Now, the good news is, companies like us realize that that's the attack vector and that's where the attacks are headed. So we're investing heavily in AI and machine learning technology to make sure that, one, that it's easier for us to give, high confidence to users like you and others that, hey, this email that's coming to you, it's 100% or 99.9% a phishing attack. Because I looked at the image looks like a complete fake, because Wells Fargo image doesn't look like this. The link goes to an IP address range that doesn't even belong to the bank, even if it was some of the banks have weird email addresses and weird IP addresses that's like wellfargo.to.mail.ad. It's like, shoot, I don't even know if that's legit. Even though I'm logged in right now and I think it's legit, I don't even know if that's legit. But our tools have the ability to bring all this context that you and I don't know. We don't know what VPC or VPS, some virtual server sitting in the cloud that Wells Fargo was using with a different IP address range or a DNS entry, but a tool like ours can go in and get all that data, put it in context of the user's usage of that link and usage of that email, and say, yeah, it doesn't make any sense. This is completely fake. It's complete phishing. We can tell from every part of this email that this is not legitimate. So yeah, there are going to be tools like companies that like ours that are going to be building capabilities using AI and generative AI. But look, I still believe there's always going to be an edge to the attacker. What percentage it is varies greatly depending on the industry and who you are. But there's always going to be a slight edge. It's kind of like the house edge
Yeah.
at the casino. The casinos always have a percentage or two over you when you're betting on the
Yeah.
table, right? So they're always going to have an edge. So let's be realistic about that. Let's accept that, because the moment you do, like, I love Coinbase. When they started their platform and their company, they started with a mindset of being breached. Like, hey, we're going to get breached. What are the things that we need to be mindful of when we get breached? Like,
Yeah.
how do we recover from it? So if you have a breach mindset and you accept the fact that you're not always going to be 100% right about everything, you're not always going to be 100% in your security posture, you can start to build some good plans, and you can start to be a bit more mature about how you handle your security. And if you do that and you adopt AI and new sophisticated tools like the ones that Trellix puts out there, you're going to be in much better shape when dealing with some of these sophisticated or history major attackers who know nothing about malware.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have that it's not if, it's when type of mentality. It helps companies respond more effectively when they do get hit. It also makes the attackers work a lot harder in getting whatever they want to get to. Ideally, in doing so, you'll have greater visibility to at least minimize the damage, respond to it, shut it down, whatever the case may be. So I'd agree 100%. Great advice. One of the things you mentioned before, too, was or the report actually talked about this a great deal as well, in terms of developing those internal skills, those security experts, they have the skills to develop these plans and implement them. What have you seen in working with customers, either in terms of recruiting, retaining, or developing internally the type of talent we need to help better defend our organizations?
So I actually want to share a story. Coincidentally, I just had this conversation with a friend of mine. His name is Ross Young, and he's CISO over at Caterpillar Financial. And he just shared something that was completely amazing. I mean, he's a brilliant guy. Um, he shared with me that, look, he's obviously seeing the same problem that everybody else is, which is there's not enough talent out there for me to go poach
Yeah.
or grab and go bring in. But one secret sauce that he's developed is he's saying, look, there's this group of people that have been largely ignored, which is the folks with disabilities or who need an extra help in kind of doing things. And he's like, one of the things I realized is some of the mundane aspects or some of the things that are hard for me to recruit for, I can train for. So he grabbed a group of people who aren't always going to be given the opportunity to get into cybersecurity, and he said, I'm going to have you focus on some of these sort of rudimentary, repeatable tasks. They still have to be done by a human today. There's still things that somebody has to pay attention to, but I don't really need to fill it with a person who's been in cybersecurity for a long time. So he focused on that, and he said, look, I'm going to bring that talent in here. The other conversations that I've had with other CISOs, which I thought was also interesting, is that there are folks who have very little experience in cybersecurity, meaning they're coming straight out of college and they're going to get most of their experience on the job that you hire them for, which is totally fine. You should. And then there's folks who are extremely seasoned, and I think a lot of it's because of how cybersecurity sort of came into to the market. But there's this middle layer of the grunts, the workhorse, the people who are doing threat hunting, the people who are putting out fires, the people who know enough about these malwares and attacks because they've dealt with it in other companies. That's the one that's the hardest to find, the middle of the patch. So you can get really seasoned folks who are in the C-suite. You can get folks down at the bottom, right, just entering the market. But the middle, the experienced professionals who are at the 5 to 10 year mark in cybersecurity, those are really, really hard to find. So that talent pool I think is mostly going to stay constant as the market demand grows. That curve is never going to meet its match, meaning the demand is going to be like this,
Yeah.
and the talent is either going to plateau or start to diverge. And that's just the reality of it. And that gap, in that curve and the plateauing of people, that gap is going to get filled by tools. The tools is
Hmm.
where the CISOs are going to rely more and more on and say, look, I don't have the experienced experts. I need some tool to develop, automated playbooks for me.
Looking ahead next 12 to 18 months or so, you've talked about a number of different things you see on the horizon. Any other trends that you think are really going to have a big impact going ahead in the near
Automation
future?
is going to be key. Automation is
Yeah.
going to be key. Your car's driving itself. Your coffee maker is generating coffee on its own. Why the heck don't we have that in a prolific way in the SOC? Like, why do I
Yeah.
need to look at a screen? Let the computer do its job. Let it do all the heavy lifting for me. Just give me an event before you decide to push an update or remedy a workstation because it got breached. Just give me a prompt confirming that I want that to happen. Maybe I do, maybe I don't, right? Let the machine do all the threat hunting and then tell me if this is something that's real or not. So that's the trend. we're going to go closer and closer to autopilot for the cybersecurity world. And it's happening a lot faster than even I expected, to be honest with you, because the technology is there, the demand from the market is there, people are seeing the value of it, and you know the best thing about being in my role is I can sit next to the CISO, and the CISO tells me, "Hey, I want to buy this tech. I need to make a business case to the CIO and to the CEO to get the funding to go do it. Help me build the business case." And we give them all this data and all this great context on why they should get this tool that's tailored to their environment, and boom, now they have the ability to get this, you know, new sexy automated capability in their platform inside their environment. And over time, the burden on human resources is going to be reduced. So, for example, if every year you're adding 5 headcounts to your security operations team because you had to cover night shift and you had to cover all these events, those additional headcounts may not be needed in the SOC. They may be needed in threat hunting because the day-to-day care and feeding of events is being dealt by a machine. So we make these trade-off conversations with CEOs and CISOs and say, the cost savings that you're going to get on people, you can apply towards a tool, and over time, you're going to have more consolidation of tools because you're not going to need all this, you know, overlapping capability, and the industry is going to mature. So yes, depending on the context, to give you a kind of a quick answer, if you're immature in SOC, you're going to have to make an investment. If you're a large enterprise customer, you're likely going to be saving money. Not you're going to be buying something for the short term. There's going to be overlap for about a year because you're going to make sure that, you know, the 747 and 777 are flying together. But eventually, you're going to sunset the old stuff, go to the new tech, and you no longer have to pay for the fuel cost of that 747 because all your users, all your events are in that new 777 plane.
Well, I think we need to start looking at this as from a competitive perspective as well. If the competition starts investing in a greater piece of equipment that turns out more product, we're going to make the same investments there to match their productivity. The hackers, the bad guys, they're investing in new strategies, new talent. I mean, their talent acquisition is impressive, as well as new technologies to do what they need to do. In order to keep up and compete with them, we need to do the same. So,
did you know some of the ransomware people have like lawyers and HR teams? It's crazy.
It's incredible.
They operate like a business.
These groups, I was talking to one expert, and he's talking about, well, the reason that there always is more attacks towards the end of the year is because these individuals have quotas they need to hit. Just like a salesperson has their sales budget, hackers got their budget too, and that's why you'll see sometimes the expedite at the end of the year. So it's crazy in terms of how complex and how savvy these organizations have become. So
yeah, and look, that's what we got to remind CEOs and CIOs. The CISOs know this, but we have to remind the executive leaders that we need the investments from that. Hey, this is what you're operating against. They have an HR team just like you do.
Yeah, and they're recruiting probably better, quite honestly, because they pay more and it's fun and everything else. But
maybe I should go take a look. Subject. Maybe I can get a bigger bonus out of those guys than I can on the other side.
Hey, stay on this side of the fence here, man. Come on. Thanks, Karan. And for more information on the work Trellix does, you can check them out at Trellix. That's TRELLIX.com. Thanks for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity topic or story you'd like us to explore here on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Karan Sandhi, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.